and hope you all enjoy this retrospective look back to 1970. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ellen, and thank you for inviting me, and thank everybody for coming here tonight. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been doing journalism since 1971. I was 15 years old. I was on WRKL radio in Rockland County on a show called Tiger Talk. 15 years old. I was also working for the Nyack Journal News and the Bergen Record. 1978, I did work with WNEW after I broke the story that John Lindsay was running for Senate in New York in 1980, and it got me on WNEW, and it got me to meet Julius LaRosa, basically, at the AM side. He was a great guy, Julius LaRosa. I've, in my past, interviewed Ronald Reagan, Ted Kennedy, Julian Bond, Ralph Nader, Jack Kemp. I covered the returning hostages from Iran at Stewart Air Force Base up in Newburgh in 1981. So I guess in history and all the things I've done over the 49 years I've been doing this, it qualifies me to actually talk to you. I don't know what else it qualifies me for, but I'm talking to you. That is Ann Vecchio. And that probably is the most famous picture of the decade of the 1970s, taken by a student at Kent State University by the name of John Philo. Ann Vecchio was a 14-year-old runaway who was at Kent State University. And by the way, if you have any questions, I will take them through the chat because I'm going to have to mute you. And I don't want to necessarily do that, but I am because and I'll allow the participants to unmute themselves, but I have to in the event that somebody decides to Zoom bomb me. Anyway, that's Ann Vecchio. She's a runaway, and she is over one of the fallen students at Kent State. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo done by a student at Kent State, and it kind of summarizes the whole year of 1970, Vietnam protests at home. But there were other things that went on during 1970, and we're it's a 50-year retrospective of it right now. That is Seattle, and that is not far from where my daughter lives in Seattle. And that's the Seattle Police Department, and they're facing off against demonstrators that decided to block the highway in Seattle. And this is a scene that's repeated and repeated and repeated throughout the United States in 1970. Massive demonstrations. The Vietnam War is continuing. The Vietnam War had started really in earnest in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And it is now more than 5 years and 2 presidents in. Richard Nixon campaigned on getting out of Vietnam. We're still in Vietnam, we being the United States, in 1970. And there he is, Richard Nixon. I dealt with Nixon between 1985 and 1990. He would return to prominence as a senior statesman in 1985 by being the arbitrator of the Major League Baseball umpires' dispute with the owners. Richie Phillips brought him in. He was the head of the umpires union because Julie and David Eisenhower lived next door to Richie, and Dick and Pat were babysitting every weekend down in Philadelphia. So Richie said, come on down. You want to arbitrate this? Peter Ueberroth said yes, and Richard Nixon would return to a senior role as an analyst in 1985, thanks to Richie Phillips. But here, this is May of 1970. It's very, very early in the morning. It's the crack of dawn in Washington, D.C., and Nixon decides he's going to meet with some of the protesters, which didn't make the Secret Service all too happy. The story, of course, is Vietnam. The troops are still in Vietnam. The calendar flips to 1970, but the problems from the Summer of Love, 1967 or 1968 or 1969, don't magically disappear. The Vietnam War is raging, but there is one war that ends. That is in Africa, the Biafra War. The Middle East remains a powder keg, but in the Middle East, this time around in the Middle East, hold on one second, I'm letting somebody in. This time around, it's not a dispute between the Israelis and the Arabs. It's an internal dispute in Jordan. The Cold War continues between the Soviet Union and the United States, and racial divisions remain, even though it is now 6 years since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law back in 1964. So the calendar may say 1970, but old problems remain. You might remember this picture if you watched any kind of TV the way I did in 1968 or 1969. You might remember the commercials from CARE. Remember the CARE packages, and the CARE packages would be sent to Biafra. This war started in 1967. Biafra was a breakaway region in Nigeria, southern Nigeria. The Biafrans thought that they were not getting a fair shake from the central government in Lagos, Nigeria, and they decided, hey, we're going to break away from this thing. The Nigerian Civil War starts July 6, 1967. It ends on January 15, 1970. Biafra represented nationalist aspirations of the Biafran people. They felt they could not exist with a northern-dominated federal government. But the war is really over by 1968 because Nigerian troops surrounded Biafra. They captured the coastal oil facilities and the city of Harcourt. And the blockade was aided and abetted by the Brits, by the English. And it would lead to mass starvation, which is why you saw the commercials on TV, because CARE tried to get packages into that part of Nigeria. During the 2.5 years of war, maybe 100,000 military casualties, and the estimate of starvation of Biafran civilians, somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million. And that is the flag of Biafra. Didn't last very long. Should have lasted only a year, but and it should have been done. But the two sides got heavily involved. That led to mass starvation with the blockade. The British forces surrounded, the Biafran forces were surrounded by the Nigerian federal government forces and were forced to surrender. Nuclear proliferation among one of the things that was going on in 1970. In March, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty went into effect. It was ratified in the United Nations. And the purpose of this treaty in 1970, which was signed off by Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union and Richard Nixon, was to prevent the further spread and creation of nuclear weapons, to work toward complete disarmament, and for nations to cooperate with one another in the safe development and use of nuclear energy. Guys in Vietnam, there they are. They haven't gone anywhere. Some have come home, but a lot who were supposed to come home would remain in Vietnam in 1970. Of course, and the Vietnam War starts really on August 7th, 1964. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and that authorized the President, Lyndon Johnson, to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression by the communist government of North Vietnam. How did we get here? Or how did the United States get there in 1964? Well, John Kennedy, when he became president in 1961, vowed that South Vietnam would not fall to the communists. There was an old theory called the domino theory, that if South Vietnam would fall, Laos would fall, and Cambodia would fall, and Thailand would fall, and it would all become communist. The old domino theory, backed up by Robert McNamara, who decided that, yeah, let's support Diem in South Vietnam. He's knocked off in 1963. The people that come in, the Americans decide to support, and they go in, fully in 1964. The Gulf Tonkin Resolution came on the heels of an alleged attack of 2 U.S. naval destroyers stationed off the coast of Vietnam, and it begins America's full-scale involvement in the war. There were advisors in Vietnam. That number would grow to 500,000 men and women in Vietnam by 1968. Richard Nixon is having a lot of problems with Vietnam. Remember, there's the moratorium in October of 1969 when somebody like Tom Seaver of the New York Mets came out against the Vietnam War, which was highly unusual for a baseball player to take a stand against the Vietnam War, or any stance for that matter, socially. Nixon sees that there are all sorts of demonstrations going on in Washington and around the country, and he gives a talk on November 3rd, 1969, The Great Silent Majority. The term popularized by Richard Nixon in that speech on November 3rd, 1969. So tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. Okay, what is the silent majority? Well, a Nixon administrative official said that the silent majority was a large and normally undemonstrative cross-section of the country that until last night, which is on November 3rd, 1968, refrained from articulating its opinions on the war. Nixon referred to the vast majority of Americans, and this is when I'm usually live, and I tell people they don't have to answer it, but I asked who protested against the Vietnam War, who was for the war, who was over there. And I've gotten some really interesting answers over the years, including one woman who said, we felt we were protecting American interests by demonstrating against the Vietnam War, pointing out that it was causing harm to our young men and women who were there. And so I've gotten a whole variety of comments over the years, over the 2 years I've done this talk, about demonstrations and all. But anyway, Nixon referred to the vast majority of Americans who did not take part in the mass demonstrations, nor participate in the counterculture. I've never had anybody tell me what the counterculture really was. It was a made-up term, like so many other made-up terms that go right through the media, and the public discourse in the country. The people who were involved, they were not the older generation, the World War II vets. You would think they would be pro-war, but they weren't necessarily pro-war. The World War II vets by this point are in their 50s. Some of them might be a bit younger, could be in the mid-40s, but most of them are in their 50s. Some of them supported the war, some of them didn't. But there were young people in the West, Midwest, and South. Notice they didn't look at the Northeast and say, we're getting support from young people in the Northeast. A lot of demonstrations in New York and Washington and Boston. And they felt they were eroded in the Northeast, the people who were pro-Vietnam, many of whom would eventually serve in Vietnam. And there were protests. That is the Reverend Carl McIntyre with his wife, Ferry McIntyre. And he leads a pro-war parade, although he says it's a pro-troop parade, in support of the troops in Vietnam on February 4th, 1970. Coincidentally, that was the second anniversary of Martin Luther King being assassinated, and the third anniversary of Martin Luther King speaking at the Riverside Church up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, saying we got to stop this nonsense and get out of Vietnam. Anyway, there is Carl McIntyre and his wife leading this demonstration in Washington. With a Bible in hand, the Reverend Carl McIntyre and his wife, Ferry, lead the March for Victory on Pennsylvania Avenue. That's April 4th, 1970. McIntyre said his parade was a demonstration for military victory in Vietnam. Meanwhile, there's the governor of the state of Georgia, Lester Maddox, who is a part of the McIntyre parade, and he is addressing people in front of the Washington Monument supporting the war. Oddly enough, Lester Maddox later on in that year would be supporting what some people, or would help support what some people thought was a draft dodger, Muhammad Ali. We'll get to that when we get to later on in the year. Lester Maddox, the governor of Georgia, was a restaurant owner and then a governor of Georgia. And he once said, just in case some of you communists, socialists, and other integrationists have any doubt, the Pick Rick, which was his restaurant down in Atlanta, will never be integrated. If you want some fried chicken, it'd have to be something other than Pickwick chicken. Lester Maddox, who spoke at that demonstration. Now, while all of this is going on, there's a guy by the name of Norman Lear, who you might have heard of. Norman Lear was a writer going on TV, going back to the Colgate Comedy Hour, and also was a writer for Martin and Lewis back in the 1950s. And he's beginning to get into television production along with his partner, Bud Yorkin. And they see a show in England, and they're going to bring this show over to the United States. And they hope to have brought it over in 1968. And they're pitching this show, which would eventually be called All in the Family, to ABC and CBS in 1968 and 1969. In 1970, ABC says, you know what, we're not interested in the show anymore, but CBS is. And they cut a deal with Norman Lear and Tamden Productions. And Norman Lear is writing, when you see the show, which premieres in 1971, but he is writing a history of 1970 that he's going to use when the show goes into production later in 1970 and finally gets onto the air in 1971. And of course, Sammy Davis Jr. was probably the biggest star that was ever on All in the Family, and he was on in the beginning of the year. Incidentally, Archie Bunker would be somebody who would be part of the silent majority. 1970, all this writing is taking place, and the show premieres in 1971. Getting back to the Nixon administration explainer of what the silent majority is, many Americans, particularly working class and middle class whites, responded to the turbulence of the late 1960s, the urban riots, the anti-war protests, the quote-unquote alienating counterculture. Nobody has ever really explained what that was to me. By embracing a new kind of conservative populism. Sick of what they interpreted as spoiled hippies, the hippie movement was dead as of October 6, 1967, with the funeral of the hippies by the Diggers in San Francisco. And there is no philosophy, there is no written material that anybody who is a hippie ever left behind. There is no doctrine, no ideology. It's just, let's go get high and have a good time in San Francisco. Spoiled hippies, whining protesters, tired of interfering government that, in their view, coddled poor people and black people at taxpayers' expense. These individuals formed what political strategists called a silent majority. And again, that would all come out in the All in the Family episodes in 1971. Vietnam, still there, haven't gone anywhere. But on April 20th, Richard Nixon announced he would be withdrawing 100,000 troops from Vietnam. However, 2 weeks later, the United States invaded Cambodia, thus extending the war and seemingly precluding further withdrawals. And things would get very, very testy on college campuses shortly after Nixon holds his contentious news conference announcing that the United States was involved in Cambodia. And there is Nixon right there. It's right there, right there. That's Cambodia. That's next to South Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese, they're going through Laos and they're going through Cambodia to supply their troops in South Vietnam. So Nixon is explaining why South Vietnam and now Cambodia and why Americans are in Cambodia. The Cambodian invasion was a series of military operations. It was conducted in eastern Cambodia in 1970. It's the policy of Richard Nixon. 13 major operations conducted by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam start April 29th, and that's through July 22nd, and the U.S. is involved for approximately 61 days between May 1st and June 30th. May 1st is the day that we find out what's going on in Cambodia, and by May 4th, campuses around the country are enraged. That is Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, and that is the Ohio National Guard, and they are ready for battle with unarmed students. You will find, because the Scranton report, which would come out a few months later, said it, you will find that you had the armed National Guards against unarmed students at many campuses in the United States. Kent State. Shootings take place May 4th, 1970. Members of the Ohio National Guard shoot at unarmed college students during a mass protest against the bombing of Cambodia by the United States military forces. There were 28 guardsmen. They fired approximately 67 rounds over a 13-second period. They killed 4, wounded 9 others, one of whom suffered permanent paralysis. Some of them just innocent bystanders who were just looking to see what was going on. Some of the students were protesting against the Cambodia campaign. Nixon announced during a television address, very contentious news conference also, on April 30th of that year, that this was happening. Other students who were shot just were walking by, just observing the protests from the distance. The governor of the state of Ohio, James Rhodes, gave the order to shoot to kill if necessary. And I gave a talk on a cruise ship last year when I was speaking on cruise ships, which you can't do right now. And there was a guy from upstate New York. And I gave this talk, and he came up to me afterwards, and he was telling me a story about how a guy that he had grown up with was part of the New York National Guard. And he said to the guy, he said, if Nelson Rockefeller, glad you asked that question, if you said to if Nelson Rockefeller gave the order to shoot to kill, would you shoot to kill? And the guy said yes. That was the last time that the guy spoke to his former friend. It was splitting people apart. Vietnam was tearing people apart. You know, 1968 was supposed to be the year of change, but if you look at 67, you look at 69, you look at 70, the country is coming apart at the seams over Vietnam. And there is Ann Vecchio over the student. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph, one of the major photographs of the 20th century. She goes back to Kent State along with John Philo, who took the picture. Every once in a while, when there's some sort of milepost anniversary, whether it would, and you couldn't do it this year because of COVID-19, but she was there at the 45th anniversary and the 40th. She was a runaway from Florida who somehow ended up at Kent State University and then ended up in California. Many of the students were ready to launch an all-out attack on the National Guard at Kent State. They didn't have any weapons. The faculty started pleading with the students. The faculty led by Glenn Frank, get out of the common area. Just get out of the common area. Let the ambulance, let the emergency personnel deal with the wounded and the dead. And the Ohio National Guard, eventually there were some legal actions against them, and the jury found nothing. There was nothing there. They were just acting out an order. The shootings would lead to protests on college campuses. Some of you, I can't see your faces. I know that when I do this live, I can see faces, and I could see some of you, or some of the people, still years later getting very upset over all of this. Anyway, college campuses erupt. Initially, 450 campuses around the country have to close. There are both violent and nonviolent demonstrations. Students were unable to take their finals, and they could either choose pass-fail for a course or the average of their last test and live with that because college campuses were closed down. That is Buffalo, New York, and as you can see, somebody is ready for action during what they thought was going to be rioting in Buffalo, New York. A whole bunch of young people going up Main Street in Buffalo, some of them in high school. And why some of them in high school? Well, if you're in 12th grade in 1970, you're going to get the call up in 1971. If you're in 11th grade, you're going to get the call up in 1972. If you're in 10th grade, and I was in 9th going into 10th grade, and I was a year ahead, so I didn't have to worry about it until 1974. But there was the possibility that this non-ending war, that you might be called up at some point or drafted, and then make decisions of whether or not you wanted to go into the Army or head up to Canada. In Buffalo, after the Kent State killings, there were thousands that marched down the main street. High school students joined in. Club-swinging Buffalo police fired tear gas. Rocks were hurled through bank windows. Students were gassed. On May 7th, 1970, at the University of Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo, police filled the student union with tear gas and birdshot. 4 students were wounded. Take a look at that picture. Take a good close look at that picture. That is the University of New Mexico. And you can see the New Mexico National Guard. And they have bayonets at the end of their rifles. Just look at their rifles. These are student demonstrators who are running away. And hey man, don't you just dig, using 1970 talk, don't you just dig the threads on that guy, that white and black pair of pants. Anyway, so there you go. May 8th, that's when 11 people were bayoneted at the University of New Mexico by the New Mexico National Guard, confrontation with student protesters. The governor of the state was David Cargo, and he called in the National Guard because he had been given what turned out to be false information by state police that the protesters were armed and dangerous. They had no weapons. And that is Lower Manhattan in front of Federal Hall near Wall Street. There is somebody if you're from New York, you recognize those call letters, WMCA. If you remember the good guys in the yellow t-shirts and the good guys t-shirts. But radio stations used to cover news. And this is a demonstration, a pro-war demonstration down at Federal Plaza, or rather in front of Federal Hall by Wall Street. Impeach the Red Mayor. That's John Lindsay. He's responsible for me getting on WNEW. He gave me a scoop. And this is a protest that was organized by a guy by the name of Peter J. Brenner, who would end up in the Nixon administration. That was on May 8th, and it was held partly in reaction to the Kent State killings. And it was organized by Peter J. Brenner, who would eventually become the U.S. Labor Secretary, and it was called the Hard Hat Riot. And construction workers went back and forth with protesters, and it got Peter Brennan the job eventually. But Nixon has a problem. Nixon has a big, big problem. He looks out his window, he sees protesters, he has contentious news conferences here and there because people are not letting him off the hook. The Washington media, led by Helen Thomas in those days from UPI, among other people, and they're not letting him off the hook. They're going after him, hook, line, and sinker with every question possible. So he comes up with a scheme. He's going to go meet with the protesters. So he has this news conference on Friday night, May 8th at 10 o'clock, and he's still up at 2:15 in the morning. He's making phone calls, then he tries to get some sleep. He wakes up, he puts on some classical music, Rachmaninoff, and then he takes the curtain, looks like that, and says, people. He sees all these people gathering in the darkness on the mall in front of the White House. Comes up with this plan, He's going to take his valet, he's going to call his valet, get him up, a Cuban immigrant by the name of Lolo Sanchez. And he's going to bring him down to the Lincoln Memorial because the valet, Sanchez, has never seen this. The Lincoln Memorial all lit up. And he figures at 5 o'clock in the morning that his valet should see what the Lincoln Memorial looks like at 5 o'clock in the morning. Hey, why not? So he tells his Secret Service, come on, get together, we're leaving. So we could see, so they could go see the Lincoln Memorial. And maybe, just maybe, he could talk to the protesters, the anti-war protesters, while he's there, which is a Secret Service nightmare, as you might imagine. They're not prepared for this, and Nixon decides he wants to go for a stroll. So he informs the Secret Service, we're doing this. The small party leaves the barricaded White House in the darkness, because Sanchez has got to see the Lincoln Memorial, around 4:35 in the morning. So they get there, Sanchez sees the memorial, and Nixon gets to what he needs to do. He needs to talk to this small group of protesters who are there because there's going to be a major rally later on that day. Then Nixon decides, and if you knew anything about Richard Nixon, he was not one for small talk. He had no sense of humor, but he tries with these people, these demonstrators. This is in the Nixon talking to the students. To get the conversation going, ask how old they were, what they were studying, the usual questions. Several of the students said that they attended Syracuse University. There was an article in the Washington Post next day, and they talked to the demonstrators, the protesters, and they asked, what did the president ask you? Well, Nixon commented on how good the football team was at Syracuse University. And this is the quote from the Washington Post. I hope it was because he was tired, because most of what he was saying was absurd. One of the Syracuse students told the Washington Post, here we had come from a university that's completely uptight, on strike. And when we told him where we were from, he talked about the football team. And when someone said he was from California, as was Nixon, he talked about surfing. Who knows? He might have talked about Beach Boys music as well. Hang 10. But that's the crowd that day in front of the White House, impeached Nixon and the Fourth Reich and all of that stuff that's all going on, the demonstration in front of the White House. Nixon's rambling dialogue, according to the Washington Post and the people they interviewed, covered various topics from travel and marriage to race relations and pollution. He did start the Environmental Protection Agency, but eventually he got around to his primary purpose, explaining his recent actions on Vietnam because they were motivated by a desire for peace. I had tried to explain in the press conference that Friday night that my goals in Vietnam were the same as theirs. Stop the killing, to end the war, to bring peace. Our goal was not to get into Cambodia by what we were doing, but to get out of Vietnam. There seemed to be they did not respond. I hope that their hatred of the war, which I could well understand, would not turn into a bitter hatred of the whole system, our country and everything it stood for. I said, I know that probably most of you think I'm an SOB, but I want you to know that I understand just how you feel. Afterwards, he goes to the Capitol building. Why the Capitol building? Well, he wants to take Sanchez on the tour of the building, and he wants some hashed potato browns. He hasn't had those in a while, and they had good hash browns at the Capitol, even though it's a Saturday at the Capitol cafeteria. So the detail has to go down to the Capitol. They walk through the nearly deserted building. Nixon's a tour guide, pointing out the sights in the House chamber. And then he goes to his old seat. Remember, he was a congressman from California from 1947 through 1953, or into 1953, when he became vice president. So he takes a seat, his old seat, and he goes to Manolo and says, give me a speech. He does. Then they go off to breakfast. He wanted some hash browns. They had a famous hash diner there, but it was closed. He would go off to the Mayflower Hotel and have breakfast with Sanchez and the Secret Service detail. And then he would go back to the office and start talking to people like Henry Kissinger and H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff. The chief of staff, Haldeman, wrote about the Lincoln Memorial visit. I'm concerned about his condition, and noted that Nixon's behavior that morning constituted the weirdest day so far. We remember Kent State, but we don't remember Jackson State. That is a traditional black school in Mississippi, historic black school in Mississippi. We know about the shootings at Kent State, but what's forgotten is May 15th. Jackson City and Mississippi State Police killed 2 and wound 12 at Jackson State College, now Jackson State University. Death toll at the colleges, 6. Wounded, 9 at Kent State, 12 at Jackson State, another 11 at New Mexico. So you got over 30 all on college campuses in May of 1970. 900 campuses were closed down. 35,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized. 21 campuses were occupied. Later on, Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's advisor, said the crisis left Nixon on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The Scranton Report. Nixon appoints William Scranton, the Republican governor of Pennsylvania, bipartisan commission to find out what happened, why it happened on college campuses. What could be done in the future to prevent that kind of, well, damage to the schools, deaths, people getting wounded on campuses, the rioting. What could be done? On June 13th, 1970, Nixon established the Presidential Commission on Campus Unrest, known as the Scranton Commission, and the charge: study dissent, disorder, and the violence breaking out on campuses, colleges, and universities across the nation. In September 1970, the report would come out and concluded the Ohio National Guard shootings on May 4th, 1970, unjust. While this is all going on, there is Robert Dole. Robert Dole, who lost the use of his right arm during World War II. Robert Dole is a young senator from Kansas at this point. He had been in Washington for about a decade, first as a congressman, then as a senator. Robert Dole, of all people, wants to see the United States out of Vietnam. So he offers an amendment on June 24th to the Foreign Military Sales Act. The Senate is going to vote on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and they vote 81-10 to repeal it. There would be another vote a couple of weeks later, July 10th, 1970. And again, it would be about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And by a 57-5 vote, let's repeal it. The July 10th vote was the second time within 3 weeks that the Senate wanted to undo the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. On October 12th, Vietnam War, Nixon announces 40,000 troops would be withdrawn before Christmas, November 10th, for the first time in 5 weeks, 5 years rather. An entire week ends with no reports of combat fatalities in Southeast Asia on the American side. All this going on, and the Beatles split up. The dream is over. It's the end of the 1960s. Paul McCartney announces on April 9th he's quitting the Beatles, but the Beatles have never gone away. They have always been there. They break up. They never worked together again as a 4-man unit. They worked as a 3-man unit in 1973 and also in the 1990s. Let It Be would be released as the final album a month later, May of 1970. The new movie, Get Back, and the new album was supposed to come out this year, 50th anniversary, but it won't because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Apollo 13. Apollo 13 takes off, heads for the moon. Now, going to the moon had become rather blasé at this point. The ratings, TV ratings, had plummeted substantially from the Neil Armstrong landing in July of 1969 with Buzz Aldrin to Apollo 12 with Charles Conrad and Ellen Bean walking on the moon. The ratings just dropped, and by early 1970, let's pull money out of the space program, nobody is interested. But this thing is going to the moon. Jack Swigert, who was one of the astronauts along with Fred Hayes and Jim Lovell, or may I say Tom Hanks, because Tom Hanks played him in the movie. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. After being prompted to repeat what he said by Jack Lausmer, astronaut on the ground in Houston, Jim Lovell said, Houston, we've had a problem. Houston, we have a problem. And there was the problem. Oxygen tanks exploded in the service module on the spaceship. And there is Tom Hanks, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, Jim Lovell, the Apollo 13 astronauts. They launch on April 11th. On April 13th, the explosions. And the explosions were in the oxygen tank, and for the next 4 days, it was, let's see how we get these guys home. Because after 3 hours, the oxygen stores are all gone, loss of electricity, water in the propulsion system. I have a friend by the name of Richard Hull, H-O-L-L. Richard Hull had been with NASA from between 1960 and 74. He's the guy who straightened out the video coming back from the moon because it was upside down, showing Neil Armstrong coming down. Somebody forgot to hit a switch. He hit the switch, and Neil Armstrong came down instead of going up the ladder. But anyway, Dick told me that there were about 30 solutions on the table, and they rated them 1 through 30, whether it could be done or not. And they picked number 30, which was the riskiest, but the one they thought that was going to work the most. So they picked the most risky solution, and it worked. The command module's normal supply of electricity, light, and water lost the crews about 200,000 miles from Earth. That's Deke Slayton showing some sort of paneling that was up in the spacecraft and how they were going to plug holes in between the lunar module, which they docked with, and the command module, and they were going to plug holes where carbon monoxide and dioxide were coming in. 3.5 days later, they returned home. They returned home in the lunar module, which was made at Grumman in Bethpage, not far from you. They rationed food and water, and they did get home after 3 days. The carbon dioxide levels reached dangerous levels, but there were square filters that were put into round openings, and that took care of that. It was 38 degrees inside of the lunar module, and the lunar module pretty much brought them home, except, as I say, the most difficult and important obstacles was having the lunar module reorientated from landing on the moon to bringing it back to Earth. They were able to do that, and they were able to use all kind of old-style technology because they had no navigation functions or targeting functions. So they used onboard sextant. The astronauts improvised using the horizon where the Earth meets the atmosphere as a reference point. They were able to perform control fuel burns to shorten the time until splashdown to Earth, and they got back on April 17th, 1970, splashing down near Samoa in the Pacific Ocean. And there are the 3 astronauts, and there is the movie, which you might have at the library, or some of you probably saw in the theater, and Tom Hanks is Jim Lovell. Jim Lovell is in that movie. Jim Lovell plays an older astronaut giving advice to Tom Hanks playing young Jim Lovell in that movie, the movie done by Opie, Ron Howard. Now, I talked about the Middle East being a powder keg, and I talked about how Israel is not involved in this powder keg this year. That, of course, is Richard Nixon, and that is King Hussein of Jordan. And King Hussein of Jordan has a lot of problems, an awful lot of problems in 1970. And I'm going to give you a little story here about a guy I know by the name of Bob Friedman. I spent time with him on a cruise ship. He was one of the lecturers, a former Army intelligence guy who teaches at Johns Hopkins University. He was an advisor to Israeli prime ministers over the years and met with Yasser Arafat, among others. So he was a valuable guy. And Friedman was telling me that he meets in Amman with King Hussein one day. And King Hussein is late. They usher him into the office, him and his wife. And he's looking around and he sees 13 pictures hanging in the office. And he looks at the pictures and he recognizes that these 13 people who are all connected to King Hussein, whether it's a father, whether it's an uncle, whatever, they all died of unnatural causes. And Friedman was saying to me that he once thought whether or not King Hussein ever thought about being assassinated. Well, you know what? An assassination attempt against Hussein takes place on September 1st. And that begins the Black September crisis, which is between the PLO and Jordan. Israel is not involved in this thing at all. September 15th, King Hussein forms a military government with Mohammed Daoud as the prime minister. On September 17th, Black September, Hussein orders the Jordanian armed forces to oust the Palestinian Fedayeen from Jordan, where they had been. Black September was a conflict in Jordan between the Jordanian armed forces and the Palestinian Liberation Organization under the leadership of Yasser Arafat between September 16th and September 27, 1970, with certain actions continuing through July 17th, 1971. And of course, it was Black September that was responsible for the Munich massacre in 1972. And there is Hussein, Yasser Arafat, who is leading the Palestinian Liberation Organization as its president. They acted as a state within a state, the Fedayeen, the PLO, disregarded local laws and regulations, tried to assassinate Hussein not only once, but twice. And there were violent confrontations between the Black September people and the Jordanian army, beginning in June of 1970, and all-out wars declared in 1971, or rather in September 1970, after the PLO hijacked 3 airplanes, forcing them to land Dawson's Field and blow up the airplanes. They got all the people off, but they blow up the 3 civilian airplanes in Zakar, and they took foreign nationals hostages, and they blew up the planes in front of the international press. Not quite the first time that terrorism got into the American homes. That would be 2 years later in Munich, but it got the attention of Hussein. And there is Assad of Syria, who took over in 1969, and he decides he's going to help Yasser Arafat. The Jordanian army had surrounded cities with the PLO presence. They shelled the Fedayeen, who established themselves in Palestinian refugee camps. The Syrian force comes in. They paint the planes with Palestinian Liberation Army markings. They intervene in support of the Fedayeen, and they go ahead to Idlib, which the Fedayeen declared a liberated city. But the Syrians withdrew from Irbid after the Jordanian army launched an air-ground offensive, inflicted heavy casualties for Syria, which hadn't recovered from the 1967 war. There was pressure that was mounted by the Arab countries on Hussein, halt the fighting. And on October 13th, there's an agreement. Arafat would regulate the Fedayeen's presence, and eventually the Fedayeen would leave. And there is Arafat and King Hussein discussing things in October. The Jordanian army, though, was attacked again in January of 1971, and they drove the Fedayeen out of every city one by one. 2,000 of them would surrender in the forest on July 17th. Jordan allowed them to leave to go to Lebanon through Syria. The guy on the left is Nasser from Egypt. The guy on the right, of course, is Anwar Sadat. On September 28th, Gamal Abdel Nasser dies. And Sadat is named the temporary president of Egypt. There is an election about 2 weeks later. The referendum supports Sadat, 90.04%. Let's vote for him. He would become the president of Egypt. And he'd have a very, very interesting decade, declaring war on Israel and then signing the Camp David Accords, ending hostilities between Egypt and Israel later on in the 1970s. Charles de Gaulle, 1967, Charles de Gaulle made a talk from City Hall in Montreal. He was the French president who was going to visit Expo 67 in Montreal, the 100th anniversary of Canada becoming a country and the World's Fair in Montreal. He makes a talk, or he gives a talk, and basically says, "Long live free Quebec." Doesn't go down well in Canada. In 1967, de Gaulle never goes to the World's Fair, and he has some problems. There's some diplomatic problems between Canada and France. And Lester Pearson, who is the prime minister, who's now in the airport in Toronto, criticized de Gaulle's speech, saying statements were unacceptable to the Canadian people. In the 1950s, Quebec decided that, or Quebecois decided that they were going to try and break away from Canada. And it's a long and complicated story that involves a hockey game between the Montreal Canadiens and the Boston Bruins, and Rocket Richard hitting an official in the face, getting suspended. There are riots in the streets of Montreal because Richard's suspended for the rest of the playoffs. And there is a group that hangs on to Richard, saying it's the first time a Frenchman has stood up to an Englishman. Clarence Campbell was the commissioner of the National Hockey League. It's the first time that a Frenchman stood up since the 16th century or the 17th century. And this movement starts where Quebec rallies behind Rocket. And I spoke to Rocket about one day. He said, I'm just a hockey player. I didn't start anything up. I was just a hockey player. But the Quebecois decided that they wanted their own state. And there was a terrorist group that formed in Quebec in 1963. And that terrorist group was put down by Pierre Trudeau, declaring a national emergency. It was called the October Crisis. Members of the Front de Liberation de Quebec kidnapped the provincial deputy premier, Pierre Laporte, and the British diplomat by the name of James Cross. Trudeau invoked the only peacetime use of the War Measures Act. The kidnappers murdered Laporte. Negotiations led to Cross's release, and the kidnappers were exiled to Cuba, but they put down the Front de Liberation. Over the years, 95 bombs, mostly in mailboxes, were detonated. The largest bombing, the Montreal Stock Exchange, February 13th, 1969, causing extensive damage and injuring 27. The FLQ members had stolen several tons of dynamite from military and industrial sites, financed by bank robberies. By 1970, 23 members of the FLQ were in prison, 4 convicted of murder. The movement is over in October of 1970, at least the part that was violent. They decided to go political. One of the things that you will see in Quebec used to say arrête stop. Only on federal property you see that. Now all those stop signs are in French in Quebec, except on federal property. The end of the crisis galvanized support against the use of violence in an effort to get Quebec's sovereignty, accelerated the movement towards electoral means of getting greater autonomy and independence. Meanwhile, in Northern Ireland, they had watched Martin Luther King for many, 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 many years, and his nonviolent resistance, and the people in Northern Ireland who wanted to get away from the Protestants, the Catholics, decided they too were going to go the nonviolent route, and they were going to be resisting nonviolently against who they thought were oppressors in the English and the Protestants. Northern Ireland, there's a conflict there that started really in 1969, but 1970 to 72 is the height of the political violence, culminating in 1972. But it begins in 1969 during a campaign to end discrimination against the Catholic nationalist minority by the Protestant Unionist government and police force. The Brits sent in a bunch of troops to Londonderry in 1969 to quell what they thought was violence, and they were only supposed to be there for a couple of weeks. They left in 1998. We have just passed the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote for president in 1920. Betty Friedan organizes a women's strike August 26th of 1970. Free abortion on demand, equal opportunities in jobs and education, and free 24-hour child care centers. That was what the women's group wanted. The march would start on August 26th in front of the Plaza Hotel on Fifth Avenue, right by FAO Schwartz, and end at Bryant Park near the New York Public Library. Equal opportunity in education was taken care of by Richard Nixon in 1972. A bill by Patsy Mink, Edith Green, Birch Bayh, and Ted Stevens created equal educational opportunities for women, which was not taken care of in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They would get one of that in 1972. So the Women's Strike for Equality was a strike that took place, or was supposed to take place, on August 26, 1970, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women in America, most women, not all women, Chinese American women did not get the right to vote till later on, but gave American women, if you were the right ones, the right to vote. And there is Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mistake back in 1963 and is considered the mother of women's liberation, Betty Friedan. And she was the one who organized the strike. 3 goals: free abortion on demand, equal opportunity in the workforce, free childcare. In 1970, that is the Miss World pageant or Miss Universe pageant in London, hosted by Bob Hope. And there was a demonstration against the pageant. In 1968, there was an organization that went down to Atlantic City. That was the Burn the Bra movement. Burn your bra, which got them the attention. Burning the bra, that was in Atlantic City as a protest against the pageant, the Miss America pageant. Burn your bra, get rid of your girdles, don't wear your false eyelashes, don't do any of that stuff. You don't need to do it. And they thought beauty pageants would be a good place to strike. And they did strike November 20th at the Miss World pageant at the Royal Albert Hall in London. It is disrupted by protesters. Women's Liberation Group hurled smoke bombs, stink bombs, and ink bombs at the stage and into the crowd. That is William Safire. William Safire ended up being one of those guys at the New York Times on the editorial page. And I bring that up because William Safire causes me some problems. And I'll explain as a journalist the problems that he causes. William Safire and Patrick Buchanan were the two main speechwriters for Richard Nixon in Spiro Agnew. In fact, it was Safire who came up with the nattering nabobs of negativism talk that Spiro Agnew got. He also came up with the enemies, the media enemies were in the newsrooms at CBS, at ABC, at NBC. Life magazine, October 16th, 1970, there is Spiro Agnew, Agnew on the warpath. Agnew on the warpath, and you see Claire Booth Luce, who I once interviewed at the United States Military Academy, 1978. Women's Live by Claire Booth Luce on the cover of Life magazine. Anyway, do this radio-wise. September 11th, 1970, San Diego, Spiro Agnew. In the United States today, we have more than our share of the nattering nabobs of negativism. Agnew criticized his opponents in the press. The words written by William Safire, who would go on as a media member, a New York Times columnist who wrote the word every weekend in the Times Magazine, wrote about words. William Safire, who was declaring war against the press and would ultimately become a media member. The last really big show, now we're not talking about Ed Sullivan here, the last big rock concert was the Isle of Wight in 1970. 600,000 people, largest crowd ever for a rock concert. Jimi Hendrix's last big appearance, The Who, The Doors, Chicago, Richie Havens. Richie Havens had the longest fingernails I've ever seen on a person. I should put up the picture of my wife with Richie Havens one of these days. And he did it because he was plucking his guitar. John Sebastian, Joan Baez, who retired last year, 10 years after, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the Moody Blues, Jethro Tull, all performed there. Hendrix, one of his last performances. He died, he choked on his vomit. She died, Janis Joplin died in 1970 death, and she died from a heroin overdose. Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, 1970 deaths, both the age of 26. Hey, that's Sesame Street. Sesame Street is still on. It's in its 52nd year of being on TV. But if some Mississippi lawmakers had their way, it would have been gone by 1970, except there's a little problem. See, Mississippi, some Mississippi politicians decided that they didn't want Sesame Street shown in the state. Now, most of southern Gulfport through Biloxi is taken care of TV-wise by New Orleans. Biloxi is also taken care of by Mobile, Alabama. So those are where the PBS stations are. They're not in Mississippi. Yeah, they're in Jackson, but up by Memphis, well, Memphis is right on the border. So that takes care of that point. And over on the other side of Mississippi is Arkansas, Louisiana and Arkansas. So how they were going to take Sesame Street off non-Mississippi stations that pump their signals into Louisiana is something I don't think that they thought out. But a state commission in Mississippi voted to ban Sesame Street because of its highly integrated cast of children. I don't know how many of you have been down to McSorley's. McSorley's, the oldest Irish tavern in New York. opening back in the 19th century. And I have never been there, but friends of mine have been there who told me there was sawdust on the floor and the place stunk of old beer. Women wanted to get into that place. It was men only. McSorley's Old Ale House, the oldest Irish tavern in New York City, founded in 1854, did not allow women inside until 1970 when Betty Friedan's National Organization of Women sued them for discrimination. They threw in the towels. You want to walk on the sawdust and smell the old beer? Be our guests. And they did. They allowed women in 1970. That's the Chicago Seven. The Chicago Seven from the 1968 Democratic Convention. They have their day in court, February of 1970. All of the defendants are acquitted of conspiracy, which means they conspired to cross state lines to have a riot in Illinois. 5 of them, though, are convicted of inciting a riot. They were given 5 years each in prison, $5,000 fine, and that would be overturned by an appellate's court. And that was it. That was the end of the Chicago Seven. How that goes, Sal? I am still friendly with his grandson, Justin. His other grandson, Colin, is the Mets public address announcer. And Howard, for some reason, when I was 27, 28 years old, embraced me. I wasn't friends with him. We were acquaintances. But Howard Cosell was on Monday Night Football with Dandy Don Meredith and Keith Jackson. Keith Jackson once told me getting off Monday Night Football after 1 year was the greatest thing that ever happened to his life. He was able to survive. He wasn't sure if he was going to be able to do it with Howard and Dandy Don. Frank Gifford, Howard Cosell, rather, before I get to Gifford, was the first employee by ABC hired for Monday Night Football because they decided Monday Night Football had to be a show. And who better than Howard Cosell, if you remember his shows with Muhammad Ali. Muhammad, you are rather truculent today. If that means something good, I am. Howard Cosell. They were not friends, but on TV, they were electric together. And Frank Gifford recommended that Don Meredith would be the perfect foil for Howard Cosell. He told, run, Arledge, get Dandy Don Meredith. And he did. And Monday Night Football, it's still going strong. And the Giants played last night on Monday Night Football. The first game was the Jets-Cleveland in September of 1970. It is the longest running television show in sports, but not really the longest running show. The longest running show on TV is Meet the Press, which started in November of 1947. Ali's return to boxing. Lester Maddox, of all people, the governor of Georgia, helped him out. Because, you see, Georgia didn't have a boxing commission, and Lester Maddox could have blocked the fight. Yeah, he could have done it. State boxing commissions did. But he didn't. And in Atlanta, they found out if we got Ali to fight here, hey, if the mayor says yes, he could fight. And the mayor was Sam Massell, who was in office for less than a year, and said, yeah, let's get that fight with Muhammad Ali here. And Muhammad Ali starts his comeback in Atlanta on October 26, 1970. He fights Jerry Quarry. He wins with a third-round technical knockout. He is back in the ring. He is back in the ring for the first time in a very long time, since 1967. It was in April of 1967 that Ali lost his boxing license and his titles without due process. And there is Muhammad Ali hitting Jerry Foreman, quick fight, Jerry Quarry, quick fight. The next fight would be in New York against Joe Frazier, the fight of the century, March 8, 1971. And there is me and Ali. Unfortunately, by this point in his life, 1985, the Parkinson's kicked in, 60,000 blows to the head also kicked in, and you really couldn't do an interview with Ali anymore. That is in May of 1985. And that is me with Jim Bouton at the Yogi Berra Museum in 2007. We were both on the same podium in separate divisions. We used to crisscross all the time, and this was the ultimate crisscross. I went on at 11 o'clock. He was on at 10 o'clock. He was talking about his thing. I was talking about my thing, a day-long seminar at the Yogi Berra Museum. Ellen definitely has this book at the library, Ball 4, probably the most famous baseball book ever written. The New York Public Library said it was one of the 20 most influential nonfiction books written in the 20th century. Boughton humanized players, talked about players actually having struggles off the field, not liking where they're playing, and having a good time together. It's all in that book, Ball 4. The commissioner of baseball, Billy Kuhn, in June of 1970, called Boughton to his office and said, I want you to say that none of this happened and this was all a work of fiction. He said, it wasn't a work of fiction. It was a real thing. I went to see him up in Great Barrington last couple of years, but he had dementia. And I talked to his wife and she said, no, don't bother. But Jim Boughton wrote probably baseball's most influential book, and it comes out on June 19th. Couple of things going on. Rhodesia severs its last tie with the British Crown, declares itself a racially segregated republic. March 1st, 1970. Togo and Fiji also leave Britain. They're all part of the Commonwealth today, Commonwealth of countries, but Tonga and Fiji leave in 1970. That's Allende from Chile. Salvador Guillermo Allende Gusens was a Chilean democratic socialist politician and physician, the president of Chile from 70 to 73, head of the Popular Unity Political Coalition, the first Marxist ever to be elected president in a democracy. Pope Paul VI, an assassination attempt on him, November 27th. He's wounded in the chest during a visit to the Philippines by a dagger-wielding Bolivian painter disguised as a priest. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's Elvis and Richard Nixon. It is the first day of winter, December 21st, 1970. And Elvis wants to meet with Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon doesn't have any problems meeting with Elvis. This is the 21st of December. And Elvis stages a campaign, a letter writing campaign to Richard Nixon. And he finally gets the audience with Richard Nixon. Elvis wanted, according to his wife, Elvis wanted to get a badge from the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. He felt he should be a narc. He should be a narc. Remember that term, narc? Narc? We knew who the narcs were in high school, so it was no fun. He was going to be a narc. He was going to be a snitch. And everybody in rock and roll and music, he was going to report to the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs because he thought it was not American to take drugs. His wife, Priscilla, later wrote that he wanted a badge showing that he was from the Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Division, and he wanted a badge so he could legally enter any country wearing his guns and carrying any drugs he wished. Except there was a problem with that. See, the colonel, Tom Parker, his manager, was an illegal alien, and Elvis never left the country to perform, except performing in Vancouver and Toronto, where the colonel didn't go with him back in the 1950s. The colonel felt if he went with Elvis to any foreign country, he'd be nabbed immediately as an illegal alien and sent back to Denmark or the Netherlands from where he came. So he kept a low profile, and Elvis never played anywhere. Played Hawaii, but Elvis went to Germany, went to the Army, and after that, he never played anywhere internationally. And there they are. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley. Presley wrote to Nixon, I can and will do more good if I were made a federal agent at large, and I will help out doing it my way. He wasn't singing my way quite at that point. That would come later. I'll do it my way. Through my communications with people of all ages, except Elvis didn't really gain any fans after he went to the Army. His fans were stagnant. They just got older with Elvis. And he didn't help making those really bad movies in the 1960s. Man, he sung a song about the IRS, about paying taxes in a movie with Bill Bixby, where he's a race car driver, or Bixby is a race car driver too, and they owe money to the IRS, and they need to win a race to pay off the IRS. He sings a song about the IRS. All I need is federal all I need is federal credentials. He concluded by saying he would love to meet the president, and he did. His target, these guys, the Beatles, the Beatles. But I guess news traveled slowly to Graceland because the Beatles were no more. April 9th, Paul McCartney basically announced he left the Beatles to put out an album, McCartney. The Beatles were no more. But then again, maybe, just maybe, it took a while for Elvis to get the news. I think he did a song. If you heard the news, there's good rocking tonight. There you go. So according to people, Nixon and E got along rather well at their meeting, and Presley got his badge. During the meeting, Presley said he felt the Beatles exemplified an anti-American nature. Well, maybe it's because they came from Liverpool. And besides, the Beatles broke up in September of 1969. On December 31st, New Year's Eve, Paul McCartney would put an end to the Beatles in court. He sued the other Beatles and Alan Klein to dissolve the partnership. I wonder if Elvis got that message. So the Beatles are going to dissolve. They go to court. McCartney would eventually win. There would be no more Beatles, but the Beatles never left us. Thank you so much for the 1971, Nixon would go full criminal because the plumbers would break into Daniel Ellsberg's office. The Apollo missions to the moon would continue, and the Pentagon Papers would be released. And that is my Secret Service pass. I took that picture in 1979, and I was on the campaign trail in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. Ted Kennedy, covered the Democratic National Convention and covered a lot of the 1980 senatorial race, which got me a friend for life, Al D'Amato from Hempstead, who still sees me to this day, and it's like a dog putting his teeth into your leg. Hey, did you see my kid? Show me his kid the last time I saw him, pictures of this kid. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Ellen, for inviting me. We could open it up for questions or comments. And I will unmute everybody. If they have anything to say, please say it. I think I unmuted people, or I think you have a chance. Anybody have any comments, any questions? Or where were you in 1970?
Basis, so it's something that you definitely want to take into consideration. And the master
Anybody?
Explore and check that out.
Anybody have anything?
I graduated from high school.
Graduated from high school. I graduated in 1973. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Ellen, for inviting me. And,
Thank you for coming, Evan.
And maybe one of these days we could do it in person, right?
Someday. Hopefully soon.
Someday. That someday I don't think it's going to be for a while. But anyway, again, thank you for inviting me. I did one other talk or two other talks for you? One other talk for you. Thank you for inviting me. And before I go, I want to thank everybody who is here. And I see Paul Cohn and Ellen Zipkin and Christine, Mr. Tort. I feel like, remember the show Romper Room, Romper, Bumper, Stomper, Boo, Tell Me, Who Are You? And they'd have the magic mirror, and then whoever was the host of the show would say, oh, I see you, Paul, and I see you, Megan, and I see you, Ellen, I see you, Christine, I see you, Mr. Tort. So anyway, thank you so much for inviting me, Ellen, and thank you for spending some time with me. My name is Evan Wiener, and I hope to see you again sometime in the future. Thanks to everybody who's here tonight. Bye-bye.